Okay, so here's a brief story about critical thinking. It involves evaluation. The word critical doesn't mean negative thinking, but it means evaluative thinking in a way. It means thinking in which you're making judgments about whether you're going to believe something or whether there's something that you're going to do or something you're going to refrain from doing. So it involves evaluation, sometimes called assessment. And I use the words assessment and evaluation interchangeably, though people who are specialized in it use them slightly differently. So one of the things about critical thinking, it's based on criteria. In fact, the word criteria and critical thinking are closely linked. Uh, so, uh, so I don't just judge things based on how I feel about them or what my reaction is to them. I base them on criteria. What criteria? Well, criteria like clarity. Is it clear? Or is it accurate? Or is it relevant to what I'm working on? These ones I'm referring to are called the standards of critical thinking, and you can find them in the critical thinking community online in any of our books. So it involves critical thinking is based on criteria for evaluating how you're doing it. For example, is what you're saying precise enough for what you need it for? Right? You can be too precise, and you can be not very precise. And sometimes it's very important to be precise. Sometimes it's not very important to be precise. I'm speaking very abstractly now. I apologize, but I'll give examples if you want. Critical thinking tends to be carefully reasoned. Okay, so critical thinking tends to be reflective, analytical, and explicit. Meaning this, there are generally two different ways people understand critical thinking. One of them is it means just good thinking. Just when you think well, you're thinking critically. And and that's a legitimate use. But there's another use which is much more akin to how I use it, meaning it's reflective thinking. What does that mean? It means I not only think about the problem I'm addressing, but I also think about how I'm thinking about it. That is, I ask myself, well, what are my assumptions here? Or what are the implications of doing this? Or what other points of view should I look at? The three I've just mentioned are three of the elements of reasoning. I'm going to show them to you briefly later on if you're not already familiar with them. But critical thinking is reflective. Now, there's also critical thinking that's just good thinking. But if you reflect on your thinking, you have a much better chance of correcting mistaken impressions or jumping to a conclusion, which seems right. And then when you look at it more closely, when you reflect on it, does not seem right. Critical thinking is analytical. And what that means at heart is you take things apart. So if I hear somebody's speech or I read a book or I do an experiment or I read a poem, I'm going to be taking it apart to see what's involved in it. That's analytic thinking. And and then the third is explicit. And that's important. That's something I emphasize. It's not necessary for critical thinking. It's just important. Notice I said tends to be. Um, what that means is that as we just go through life, we're often thinking critically about things over and over again, right? We're, without being consciously aware of it, we're paying attention to what's accurate or inaccurate. We're paying attention to what things are relevant or irrelevant. For instance, I'm not now going to start talking to you about American baseball. It's just not even going to come into my mind because it's irrelevant to what we're doing. And if I did start talking about it, you would quickly say, wait a minute, that's completely irrelevant. But it's not, but it's implicit. That is, I just kind of rule out, we all just rule out all kinds of things on the basis of their being irrelevant. One of the things about critical thinking, though, is I can also do that explicitly. I can ask myself, okay, this person made the following point. How is that relevant to what she's trying to show? How is it relevant? How is it related to that? So I can ask it explicitly, and that opens me up to something. Okay, so that's critical thinking. Okay, let me push on to creative thinking. Creative thinking is different but related. It's generative. It involves coming up with stuff, or inventing stuff, coming up with it, generating things. Generating what? It involves things like coming up with new ideas or novel solutions or alternative strategies or untried new activities. dot, dot, dot. I mean, there are a lot of things. It involves coming up with stuff. Notice it's not analytical. It's not even evaluative. Uh, it, if I think of creative thinking in and of itself, but but don't but I'm going to amend that a little bit or modify it a little bit in a moment. So that seems to me to be the heart of creative thinking. It's generative, okay? And then and let me just say, I see that there are two varieties of creative thinking, maybe more, but two of them I want to emphasize. One of them is just open-ended creativity. It can be an exciting fantasy, a feat of imagination, a daydream, as well as an original solution to a problem, right? You're just sitting around and you're creating fantasies. That's one variety of creative thinking. But the other variety is going to be much more central to what we're going to be working on, and I call it inventive creativity. But don't fasten on that word. It's creativity that's oriented toward a purpose. You engage in this kind of creative thinking when you have a goal in mind. So you want to do X, Y, and Z, and you think, okay, so how can I go about doing it? And you invent, you create new ways of doing that in addition to the ones that just happen to come to your mind. So these two varieties of critical creative thinking are in some ways similar. Both of them are generative, but there's a major difference in that the first one is kind of free floating, right? You engage in a fantasy. It could be about anything. And the second one, you have a goal in mind. And what I'm going to be emphasizing mostly is this second variety, creativity. Okay, this is almost at the end of my introduction. Okay, I got one more introductory page. So critical thinking and creative thinking are interdependent. They're different, but they rely on one another. When I use creative thinking to come up with some new way of achieving a purpose, I have to make a judgment about whether it works. That involves using criteria, evaluation, or assessment. In short, it involves critical thinking. So, for instance, so let me do pure creative thinking with no critical thinking involved for you. Let me see if I can think of an example. Okay, so I might wonder, how can I teach my class algebra? So I'm going to give you a creative solution to my problem. I can ask a space alien to come in and address my class. Right? That's creative. There's nothing analytic about it. It is up in the air. It's nothing, but it's of no use. It's ridiculous. Why? Because it's not usable. It's not effective. There are no space aliens that I can call on, even if they exist, and so forth. So creative thinking, in and of itself, if you think of a pure case of just being creative, it can be anything if you don't if you don't evaluate it. When I use critical thinking, I'm now in this third paragraph. When I use critical thinking to analyze an issue, I have to figure out, generate from my own mind what questions I should be asking, what assumptions are being made, what points of view I should be taking account of, why the issue matters. All of those and many more are the product of inventive, creative thinking, right? So if I'm going to engage in critical thinking, I'm going to have to use my own creativity in coming up with my own answers to questions. If I'm going to use creative thinking and coming up with a new way of achieving a purpose, I'm going to use critical thinking to evaluate how I'm thinking.